So welcome to this week's Optimum Health Clinic Facebook Live. And apologies for running a bit later than normal. I was running late with my patients this afternoon. So this week, I thought we would do something around bouncing the boundaries, which is a term that we use for when you're starting to increase your activity level, how to do that in a way which is listening to your body, but also not being fearful of doing too much too quickly. And as always, I'll answer questions a little bit later on in the session, so feel free to post questions as we go along. And I'll also try and take questions as we go if they seem kind of fitting to what I'm talking about at that particular moment. So I think the first thing which is just important to say is one of the things which is most challenging on the recovery path, especially ironically when we start to improve, it's like we start to get a better quality of problem, i.e. when we're in a crash stage, we know, and hopefully we listen to the fact, that more than anything, what we need is significant amounts of physical rest. But as energy starts to come back, that starts to mean that we potentially have a little more capacity to start doing things. But the question becomes, how much do we actually do? Like, do I rest or do I push myself? And this can almost become like an ongoing game of mental tennis that we start to play inside of our mind. It's like on one side we think of all the reasons why we need to rest and conserve energy and build energy. And then we start to think about all the reasons why we should do more, that if we do more, then we might release some of the nervous energy that's there, we might calm down tired and wired, we might get more quality rest. And we just find ourselves going backwards and forwards between those two places. And it's true to say that we can, obviously it's true to say that we can overdo it. So we absolutely know that if we do too much activity, there's all kinds of consequences and impacts from doing that. It is also the case, and this is, I would say, a less common scenario, but it is also true to say that we can underdo it. And what underdoing it looks like is energy is starting to come back, but energy is going to our nervous system. And so weirdly, a sign of progress can sometimes be that we get an increase in anxiety. Now, it doesn't mean if we have an increase in anxiety, it always means we should do more activity. Sometimes it means we're about to crash, we need to do less activity. But sometimes what it means is energy is coming back, but energy is going to the nervous system. And if we do more activity, we may feel better as a result of doing that. i.e. physical healing and recovery is happening and it's working, therefore there is actually more energy that's available. So how do we know how much more activity to do, and how do we introduce that new activity in a way which is careful, considered and sustainable? So I think one of the things to say about this is, if you're familiar with one of the models that we have at Optimum Health Clinic around stages of recovery, that we talk about 3 different stages, and we've done other videos, and maybe we'll do a Facebook Live about this at some point, but there's definitely videos on our YouTube channel that talk about this. That bouncing the boundaries is something that's generally not appropriate at stage 1, but it's true in the second half of stage 2, and at stage 3, it's one of the most critical factors that we battle with, is bouncing the boundaries. So what do I mean by bouncing the boundaries? What I mean is, if that's our circle of activity of what we can do, I mean increasing what we do in a careful, measured, incremental way where we're bouncing the boundary rather than trying to annihilate or destroy or push our way through the boundary. One of the factors that will have often caused people to get sick in the first place is a tendency towards trying to just fight through and force ourselves to do more than we're actually able to do. So this idea of gently bouncing the boundaries doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. What comes more naturally is an idea, as I say, of just forcing and trying to crash boundaries down. So bouncing the boundaries means firstly finding the edge. Like, to use a different analogy, we need to find a stable baseline. And if we don't have a stable baseline, it's actually very difficult to start to increase our activity level, because we go up and then we crash back down again, then we go up and then we crash back down again. So we need to get some stability to our activity level. So we're fairly consistent on what we're doing day after day. And then what we want to start to do is, if there is an increase in physical energy, we need to start doing more. We want to do that very sensitively, sensibly, and carefully. Because our tendency is, that especially we have achiever patterns, is to try and do too much too quickly. So the first thing about setting the boundaries, once you've got, well, second thing, first thing is to get a stable baseline. Second thing is to think about how much more you want to do, and to do it once. And then to take at least 2 or 3 days before we try to increase that activity again. Because if you think about the delayed fatigue response in ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia, one of the things that can happen is you can do something and you'll find that day, you'll find the next day, and then the crash comes the day after that, or even the day after that. So you need to have allowed enough time for any delayed fatigue response to start to express itself before you decide that you're going to repeat doing that activity again. So if you do the activity, let's say on a Monday, and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday you're fine, you might want to try that activity again on the Thursday. If, again, you're fine, you might want to go from having 3 days between to 2 days between to a day in between to then being able to do that activity consistently. And then you might bounce the boundaries a little bit further. So what you're then doing is, rather than having a pattern of going up and crashing down and going up and crashing down, you've got your baseline, your activity goes up a little bit, you drop it back down again, you stabilize, you go up, you come down, and then you go up and then you hold that level before you then go up another level. This can be tedious, and it can be kind of against our instinctive nature if we're someone that tends to be a driven person that wants to do more. But it's much better to have a slow, solid, stable recovery than it is to have a recovery which is up and down all over the place, or a recovery where you think you're completely better in a short period of time, only to have a massive crash back down again on the other side. So I'm much, much more interested in patients building solid, stable recoveries that may take time, that are consistent and solid, than recoveries that are up and down all over the place. So if your baseline is solid and it's growing with you, it means if you crash, you're going to bounce back to the baseline rather than crash with no baseline to come back to. It's also helpful to know that there's often, when we increase activity, there's a compounding impact that can happen. So you can do something once a week and you're fine, but if you try and do it twice a week, at least that period, it can be too much. So just because you can do something once doesn't necessarily mean you can then, at that point in your recovery, start to do that thing all the time. So there's a lot of sensitivity, a lot of nuance here, and we need to give enough time and enough space to find out what we can do, and not have increases in activity be defined by us setting goals that we want to be able to do more, or thinking it's just a mind over matter. If I just decide I can do this, I'm going to be able to do it. That works in some areas in life. It really doesn't work when you're on a recovery path at certain stages of recovery. So it's also not just what you do, it's how often you do it. It's also what state you do it in. If your nervous system's calmer, you're more likely to be able to sustain more in terms of what you're doing. If you're doing something which brings you pleasure rather than something that brings you stress, that's also going to be less of a load on the system whilst you're doing it. So there's a lot of nuance, a lot more we could say about this, and I think it's also worth saying that a lot of what I've noticed really helps people with this is having enough self-reflective awareness that you can see when your achiever pattern's coming in. You can see when you've dropped all the things that have been helping you because you're feeling better, and actually you need to sustain and continue doing those things for a more period of time. Working with a skilled practitioner, which can help you identify when these patterns are happening, can help you identify when you're not listening to your body, and help you define how much you should increase boundaries by. That can also be immensely helpful. But just as a kind of starting point, and something for people just to reflect on, is this idea that you don't increase activity in a way which is just more. You go up a bit, You drop back, you stabilize, you go up again, you drop back, and then you go up and you build that as a baseline before you build up again. What can also happen is we go very carefully for a while, and then we think we're free of it, and then we just go headlong into just trying to do more and more and more and more. And there is a point later on in stage 3 where we do want to drop all of the checking and the being careful and the cautious. Something that I've said before, and said a number of times in different places. The breakthrough at one stage becomes the limitation at the next stage. So as much as this process of bouncing the boundaries is a critical breakthrough for a lot of people, at later stages of recovery, doing too much obsessing around this can become the new limitation. So remember, it's critical at a certain point, but it's not something you have to be doing every step of the way, and it's definitely not something you expect to be doing on the other side of recovery. So I can see a few questions have been building up here. So let me just track back into the questions. What do you think of the NHS MECFS clinics still pushing graded exercise? It depends how political I want to get with my answer. I suppose it's a little bit like, I am being provocative here, but it's a little bit like people walking down the street kind of naked with loincloths and beating around with kind of clubs. It's like we just don't really, it's a bit dark ages, we don't really do that anymore. Are there places for graded exercise? Yes. Those places are final stages of recovery where you're talking about deconditioning. Graded exercise is great if you're deconditioned, you need to gradually build up your exercise level. If you've got a chronic illness of which the primary symptom is fatigue and there's legitimate explanations for that fatigue, trying to override that and ignore that is very unhelpful. I've seen people using graded exercise with a great deal of understanding and sensitivity to ME chronic fatigue very helpfully. And I've seen people causing serious relapses by doing it unhelpfully. I prefer the concept of bouncing the boundaries. I also prefer the concept of trusting, listening to your body. And is there a place for sometimes having a lot more structure and building up to a structure? Yes. But it always needs to be done in such a way that what your body is telling you is a lot more important than what some piece of paper is trying to tell you. A tracking device is what gave me my walking ability back to monitor every move, no boom buster anymore. Yeah, sometimes we are doing far more activity than we realize, and having some kind of tracking device like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or something like that to actually help us see what we're doing can be really helpful. And it can become something that we start to obsess over. So again, like all of these things, at a certain stage, it can be really helpful. It needs to be done with a certain amount of caution. But yes, tracking activity in those kind of ways can be really helpful. And remember that things like, I got into using a Fitbit for a while because I loved the fact that I could track how far I was walking. And then I noticed that if I was doing weight training in the gym, the Fitbit didn't track it unless I was going into cardiovascular mode. I couldn't wear it when I was swimming, and it didn't seem to pick up yoga. So 3 types of exercise that I like to do, I got no points on my Fitbit, so I stopped using it. But I think in terms of just tracking activity level, yes, I think it can definitely be helpful. Karen is saying, this worked for me before, but as a parent, I'm struggling massively with maintaining a baseline. Yeah, when you've got significant responsibilities to other people, this can be a lot more challenging. Maybe we'll do a Facebook Live at some point around how to navigate the complexities of taking care of yourself whilst being there for other people. So that'll probably be a helpful way to address that a little bit more. But yes, finding that baseline, I talk about it with patients like it's the holy grail for a lot of people, especially once you've got the physical elements of what's happening more understood and being more clearly addressed. And for a lot of people then, getting this baseline stabilized it's critical to recovery, but it's also critical for just sanity, and stopping endlessly dealing with booming and busting and relapsing and just never knowing where you are. Paula is saying, need to work out what my baseline is. I really know I keep crashing every now and again. I just know I keep crashing every now and then. Yeah, I would also say, Paula, just also be gentle and patient with yourself in the process. Like, this sounds incredibly simple in theory, and it's easy for me to kind of sit here and talk about it. In reality, it's extremely difficult, and in reality, So we've got tons of kids outside my office. In reality, when you go past and you crash and it takes 2-3 days or a week or 10 days to get back to normal or your normal, that is just difficult. And there's just human suffering that's involved in that. And so just being gentle, compassionate and loving yourself in that process is just also part of it as well. I find I'm absolutely determined to do a stable recovery. This is Elodie, and feel I've absolutely learnt this time to not overdo it. And then as soon as I'm feeling a bit better, I get overexcited and do too much, even though I feel I'm being super aware of my achiever mode, pushing, increasing activities. Is okay. Sorry, I said that too soon. Adding activities is okay if they are obvious things, but when it's more like increasing times with the kids, that's so much more subtle and tricky. So my phone's falling over. So yeah, and that's kind of part of what I touched on a little bit earlier, and that is one of the things that's tricky here, is that we go super careful, we build up, we get stable, and just as we start to take the brakes off, we stop doing all the things that have been supporting us, and then we end up having a crash. Or we've been really measuring and being careful what we're doing, and then we just stop measuring, and we feel kind of okay, and then a week or two goes past, and we realise we've done dramatically more than we thought we'd done. And it's a balance, because if we're constantly checking what we're doing, the danger is we're constantly reinforcing an idea of illness and checking symptoms. But the other side of the equation is we also need to be sensitive and just be careful in terms of what we're doing. So if there's any more questions, feel free to post them, and I'll happily answer them now. Also, just if you want to just share with each other how you found this, or any tips, like any things that have helped any of you in your own process of bouncing the boundaries. It's often just helpful to share with other people. We often learn from other people's experiences. So feel free just to kind of post what's helped you, what supported you. If tracking activity has been helpful, maybe you want to share ways you've done that. And yeah, if there's any more questions right now, I will jump on the comment section later on this evening, and if I don't manage that, I'll certainly do it tomorrow morning, but I'll try and do it later on this evening. So yeah, I hope that's been helpful. Also, just let me know if that's been useful, helpful, comments from it. And also, if you've got anything particular you'd like me to cover next week, then feel free to also post that in the comments as well. So I will talk with... Sorry, someone's just posted, is ME/CFS possibly Lyme or co-infections? Yes. We probably should do a Facebook Live separately on this at some point. I wouldn't be the best person to do it, but someone in the clinic team, I think, probably should do that. I think there's lots of people that think they have ME/CFS that actually have Lyme's or co-infections as the underlying physical side. So having investigation into that, and often the standard medical investigations aren't always that accurate. So looking into that can definitely be helpful. Thanks for watching, everyone.